Okay, what an episode. If there is one word I would use to describe this episode, it will be
yes, 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 yes.
So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into it. We begin the episode with a Blade Runner-esque scene, and we follow the perspective of Kane, who is still on Coruscant. So we see Kane walking in this seedier part of Coruscant, letting us know that she's definitely on the lower levels of the planet. And the lower you go beneath Coruscant's surface, the more lawless it gets. So with around 5,000 plus levels, you can imagine how bad it gets the lower you go. Kane meets with an imperial probe droid, the very same type that was first introduced in Empire Strikes Back. We then see Kane converse with Gideon, making this his first appearance in Season 3, and it's good that he's back. Which is where we learn that the pirates that attacked Navarro were indeed hired by the Imperials. Gideon learns that the Mandalorians have started to work together and realizes that they have started to become a threat once again. We see tons of aurebesh throughout these scenes, but the most important ones translate to cybernetics, which I think is supposed to spell cybernetics, and bronwyn, which was a character in the Rings of Power show. And the director of this episode, Rick Famuyiwa, is apparently a very big Lord of the Rings fan. We cut to Gideon as he walks through these ray shields, which really reminded me of Obi-Wan in The Phantom Menace, and on the sides we get our first look at the newest version of the Imperial Super Commando. First introduced in the Rebels show, the Imperial Super Commando was essentially Mandalorians who decided to work for the Empire. It included characters such as Gar Saxon, and there are a few stylistic differences between both versions, but perhaps the biggest difference is that the old Super Commandos didn't wear Beskar. Their armor was made out of plastoid, the very same material as Stormtrooper armor. What's also cool about the new armor is that it actually makes the gradual stylistic transition from the era of the Empire to the era of the First Order, especially where the visor is concerned. This also confirms to us that the people who freed Gideon were not Mandalorians, but instead Imperials. Gideon walks past a number of Bacta tanks which look to be part of a cloning project, letting us know that the cloning project is still ongoing and one that has continued without Dr. Pershing, but what is actually inside remains to be seen. Gideon enters a meeting room where we see holograms of several Imperials, and while most of these Imperials present are simply named warlords in the credits, the two most notable characters are Gilead Palion and Brendel Hux. Palion in particular was previously a captain within the Imperial Navy and worked pretty closely with Grand Admiral Thrawn. He previously appeared in the show Rebels and did take part in the Siege of Lothal. And speaking of Thrawn, Palion urges patience until Grand Admiral Thrawn returns, which is really foreshadowing his return in the Ahsoka show, so probably just creating some connective tissue here. Palion then mentions that Brendel Hux is working on Project Necromancer, and Brendel Hux is of course father to Armitage Hux, who later leads the First Order back into the galaxy. And the key thing to know about Hux is that besides being an abusive father, he was crucial in the development of the First Order, which makes Project Necromancer very likely the code name for this operation. But while he played a huge part in the development of this project, he is not the actual head of the project, at least not as far as we know. That title belongs to Grand Admiral Sloane, who has mostly appeared in books so far. Gideon questions Thrawn's possible return, asking when he will be able to participate in the Shadow Council. And the Shadow Council was a secret advisory council that was first created by Admiral Gallius Rex following the fragmentation of the Empire. The idea was to use the council as a ruling body while using Grand Admiral Sloane as a figurehead who I mentioned earlier. But the Shadow Council was supposedly destroyed by Rex himself during the Battle of Jakku, in his bid to be the sole power within the Imperial faction, which ended up killing him as well. Regardless, it looks like since the events on Jakku, the Shadow Council has reformed. Moff Gideon questions Thrawn's authority and suggests looking for new leadership, which is a really subtle hint towards his bigger ambitions of being the next Imperial leader. Gideon reported that Pershing and his research has been lost, and he gets questioned on what he was doing with Pershing on Navarro, which is really a reference to the cloning project that Mando and the rest stumbled on back in Season 2. Gideon talks about how he doesn't care about cloning, which is really a lie considering the scene we saw earlier. We get a bit more Imperial political bickering before we hear Hux mention about Gideon's request for Praetorian guards. And the Praetorian Guards were of course first introduced in The Last Jedi as Snoke's personal guards, but prior to that they were initially the bodyguards of the Shadow Council. Gideon talks about the Mandalorian threat, and judging by the individual reactions, there is still some fear about a resurgent Mandalore. We then cut to Navarro, where we see the local inhabitants rebuilding the town, and we see Bo-Katan's Mandalorians arrive. With the light cruiser flying overhead, we can see the mythosaur marking underneath. The two Mandalorian factions meet each other, and it's a pretty tense meeting. But looking at both sides, you can't help but notice several differences, with the Night Owls appearing to be more as a modern military force, and the Children of the Watch more as a collection of tribes, and dare I say a little outdated, at least visually speaking. Mando meets with Greef Karga, and we learn that the Anzellans have managed to repair and modify IG-11, now known as IG-12. It's essentially a robot suit for Grogu to use and control, and I think once Grogu gets the hang of it, it's going to be pretty unstoppable. Grogu starts to use the suit as a form of communication, which really reminded me of those dog videos where dogs use buttons to communicate with their owners, so really just cute points all around. The two head into the market, and Grogu picks up a Meiluran and accidentally crushes it. Meilurans were of course the fruit first introduced in Rebels and has since appeared several times in other Star Wars shows. The Mandalorians gather for a feast, and the meat roasting over the fire here is likely the Navarro Raptavians, a creature which attacked Greef Karga back in Season 1. The Mandalorians make their way to Mandalore, and the recon party is immediately greeted by a sail barge of some sort. These turned out to be Mandalorians, and turned out to be remnant survivors of the Great Purge. And I love that while they look like Mandalorians, they are also distinctively different, with the rest of their outfit reflective of their scavenger life. Also, take note of how much older these guys seem to be, letting us know that they've been around since the Purge and why they recognize Bo-Katan's voice. We then get to hear them recount the events of the past, and we learn more about how Bo-Katan lost the Darksaber. Bo-Katan talks about how she negotiated with the ISB, which stands for the Imperial Security Bureau, the intelligence arm of the Empire. But more crucially, we learn that Moff Gideon didn't win the Darksaber through combat, which does raise some interesting questions. One of the survivors asks whether the Children of the Watch belong to Death Watch, and the armor responds that the Death Watch no longer exists, with the faction having been splintered into many warring groups. Death Watch was of course the extremist Mandalorian faction that operated during the Clone Wars, and the Children of the Watch being an offshoot of them. But what is also really interesting is that the armor seems to indicate that there are still more factions out there that are offshoots of Death Watch, which raises the possibility of more Mandalorian factions joining the cause in the future. Bo-Katan shares her concern with Mando about her ability to keep everyone together, and Mando reaffirms his loyalty. But what this scene reveals is just how tenuous her position is. All that keeps most of these factions together is a single blade, one that she has already lost before. However, luckily for her, at least the Children of the Watch don't really care about the blade. For them, the mythosaur is a far more important symbol. However, Bo-Katan's tenuous position is also why she is cautious about using the blade later on. The armor splits from the group to give medical attention to a few critical Mandalorian survivors. The crew sets out, and a cool little detail about the ship they are on is that it's powered entirely by the wind, which makes a whole lot of sense, as on a barren planet like Mandalore, it would be very difficult to acquire power sources. Paz and Axe Wolves end up fighting over Mandalorian chess, and Grogu steps in between them, something which he probably would have found difficult before having this droid suit. Bo praises Mando for his teachings, but he says, again hinting that Grogu's skills in diplomacy were acquired through Luke's training. The two give each other a subtle nod, and the crew encounter a lava beast, which is not to be confused with the mythosaur. And if you slow down the footage and pay close attention, quite a few Mandalorians do get crushed or launched by the monster. The crew make their way into the Great Forge, but are then ambushed by Imperial super commandos. Axe Wolves leaves to get reinforcements, and if you pay close attention during the battle, because the Imperials are wearing Beskar, the Mandalorians immediately start to go for weak points in their armor. A lot of the laser shots are aimed at the neck, and it's also interesting to see how once they manage to get close enough for hand-to-hand combat, the Imperials are essentially no match for the Mandalorians. The crew end up stumbling upon the Imperial base and it ends up being a trap. Mando gets captured and Moff Gideon arrives in a pseudo-Dark Trooper Mandalorian armor, in what I can only describe as an abomination and a sacrilege. The Dark Troopers were of course the droids that Mando and the team struggled against back in Season 2, and we learned that Moff Gideon's new suit is made from Beskar. Gideon sends out interceptors and bombers to destroy the Mandalorian fleet and demands that the Darksaber be handed back to him. The rest of the Mandalorians manage to escape, but not before Paz makes the ultimate sacrifice. And this is probably Paz's finest moment, and what a unit he is. I mean, despite his gun overheating, he still manages to take out the rest of the troopers. And it really took 3 Praetorian guards to break him down. Also, another interesting detail is that the weapons used by the Praetorian guards seemingly is able to cut through Beskar like butter, a detail which we see here. And so that's all for the breakdown for episode 7 of season 3 of The Mandalorian. I mean, what an action-packed episode, and I can't wait to see what they have in store for the season finale. As always, be sure to leave a comment down below, be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. I'm the Lost Acolyte, and I have spoken.